A powerful and ancient tree man, Durthu has defended the Wood Elves for millennia, not only against the forces of the outside world, but also against his own kin, many of whom see the elves as little more than intruders. Unfortunately, having witnessed the destruction wrought not only by the forces of evil, such as chaos, demons, and the beastmen, but also by the capricious behavior of the Wood Elves, Durthu has slowly become embittered and broken, creating a raging, angry spirit that seeks to destroy all who would harm his beloved home. In Total War, he marches into battle with casting the Lore of Beasts, as well as powerful battle abilities such as his own Sword of Death, as well as the Lamentations of Despair, a powerful missile attack. With a reduced hero recruitment cost for branch wraiths, he can field several of these powerful close quarters casters, and utilize them to support his armies in the field. All of his units are immune to attrition, meaning that Durthu is capable of marching his army into the most horrific of wastelands to pursue his foes wherever they may hide. With a bonus to melee attack of +10 during forest battles, Durthu's army can easily defend their forest home against all comers, being capable of destroying anything and everything that would otherwise stand against them. Unfortunately, his elite elven units caused Amber to recruit, forcing Durthu to largely rely on his own dryads, treekin, and treemen, as well as other forest spirits such as dragons and eagles, to make up the bulk of his forces. Starting out with treekin, wild riders, and dryads, Durthu's army lacks neither in defense nor in offense, making it very well rounded and more than capable of taking on all early game opposition. And thus, with vengeance in our hearts, we stride into battle, seeking to defend Athaloran against all those who would do it harm. So here we are in northern Athaloran, starting out our campaign as the faction of Argwylon. So, right off the bat, I want to do the usual disclaimer. All the stuff covered here in this tutorial is based on my experiences in very hard and legendary difficulties. So some of the stuff might not be as important to prioritize on lower difficulty settings, or it might not cause as much of a challenge, but it should still all be applicable nonetheless. Also, if you're looking for a guide on Wood Elves, be sure to check out my dedicated guide forum. This guide will be focused entirely on Argwylon. I might make some occasional references to Wood Elves, but definitely going to be this is focused on Argwylon. And it will probably be a longer subfaction guide, since alongside Skarsnik's Crooked Moon, I think Argwylon is probably the most different subfaction in the game when compared to its baseline faction. Even more so really than Clan Angrand or Wartsag's bloody hands. So definitely a bit different. So right off the bat, I do want to go over objectives. They are the exact same as they are for Wood Elves. They have to get their Oak of Ages to the stage where it is flourishing. And that of course does involve 30 amber and some money and quite a lot of turns of upgrade time. The other objective is the defense of the oak, which is and it's the exact same battle for both Wood Elves and Argwylon. It's against the Beastmen. It's just a generic kind of quest battle. So all in all, fairly simple, straightforward objectives. Going into strengths and weaknesses, these are practically identical to the ones that I listed for Wood Elves. Except unlike Wood Elves, they do have a very strong starting roster of units, with the exception of the Way Watchers, who should probably dropped immediately, since they do take up a slot of amber that you want to use elsewhere. The mix of Dryads, Treekin, and Wild Riders give you a very strong front line, some very solid damage output, and the Wild Riders can just really carry games with rear charges and that sort of stuff, so they're very powerful. They also get a very strong, in my opinion, a stronger starting hero. The Branch Wraith is much more flexible. It can help counteract your problems with public order when deployed, and it's just a solid support lord in general. Decent melee combatant, especially once you get some skill points into his melee stats, and can just provide Durthu's army with a little bit of support, especially with the once you get Lore of Life spells like Earthblood researched, or you get the skills in those. It's definitely very solid, I think. Hero start, unit start. They have very strong lords, just like the normal elves, except unlike the elves, who you want to usually make elven lords. For Durthu, you will usually want to make treemen lords, at least initially, because only treemen can fill the offices in the Gathering of the Ancients. The only non-treeman who can take up a slot here is Orion, and it's the opposite in the case of the Wood Elves. The only non-elf who can take a slot on the Elven Council is Durthu, but of course, as the Treemen only have 4 slots rather than the Elves 6, it is much easier to fill everything out. Then if you really prefer Wood Elf Lords, it's much easier to then move into fielding multiple armies of Wood Elf Lords. Um, Of course, alongside this, they have very strong tech. They have very strong lord skills. Their technology tree is the exact same as the elves. Same with their all their lord skills. It's the same stuff available to them. So there are definitely some very strong options there. They have very solid heroes, just like the wood elves. Their buildings provide some pretty tangible, solid boosts across the board, whether they be the temples or the various positions they open up. So definitely just a very nifty upgrades there. Their economy, while fairly weak on the home front, though of course pretty strong for how small of a home front it is very powerful because it's based on raiding and raising, and they can make immense amounts of money. They have access to the exact same skills and whatnot as the wood elves. With that, a bit of benefit, and you can make it even higher because with your early brand traits, if you spec straight down the bottom line, you can go into Wonders of the Forest and get massive boosts to your Wonders of the Forest. So definitely some huge benefits there. Obviously, wood elves have the access to the exact same stuff, and they can also field brand traits. It's just a little easier if you really want a gun for that early game economy. It's a little easier for Durthu because he does start off with a brand trait right off the bat. So very strong hero choices, very strong economy. Because as far as raiding and raising is concerned, they can of course trade a little bit, but once again limited like wood elves. They can't start trading until they've gotten certain buildings built. Just like wood elves, they have very fast replenishment rates. They can very easily recruit globally once you go into the late game, and of course, the Oak of Ages provides them with some pretty significant boosts. Finally, they can occupy anywhere on the map and create outposts. The structures they can build in the outposts are the exact same as the wood elves. And obviously, they're pretty weak, but the bonuses stack, and so they can quickly become a very, very strong sort of force backing your main army, or backing your main line of economy or upgrades and that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, they do have some disadvantages. Unlike the wood elves, they don't have a problem with their early game roster, but they definitely have an issue with all their units being very expensive. Dryads are in fact even more expensive than basic unshielded Eternal Guard. They are a bit better in my opinion. And generally, your armies will be relying a lot on treekin and treemen, and fortunately, you can go a little stingier on the archery department because usually you'll be much more reliant on your monster units. But nonetheless, those are very expensive to field. And when push comes to shove, your armies are definitely going to be about as expensive as wood elf armies. Just the distribution of money is going to be a little different. They also have the problem of Amber, which limits them to certain unit types or at least initially, and makes it a bit of an issue trying to balance out and play the balancing act of balancing Amber going into upgrading the tree, upgrading your home base, and upgrading your technology, because of course some of the technology is absolutely mandatory. They have the same issues with control and growth as the wood elves do. So you will definitely need to put a point to each of the Mother and Loic the Trickster. Fortunately though, because you do start with that brand trait, you can somewhat undo the problems with the early game control, which is -12 on legendary. It's absolutely brutal because of course you don't have any commandments, which is another problem, and that can be a very significant issue. They also have a pretty weak home-based economy, as we mentioned, and they cannot build any cities out of Athalorn, which can be a bit of a problem, though in my opinion isn't really the end of the world. Argwylon, when compared to wood elves, Argwylon is definitely the stronger of the two factions from a simplicity and ease of play standpoint. The wood elves are a much more glass cannon oriented faction. They're much less forgiving. Their units are much squishier. They're a little harder to build up. They don't have the same cheese options that Durthu does, and we'll be going over that in a little bit. Durthu is a bit more of a monstrous carry lord than Orion is, and Orion's already a very good lord, so don't get me wrong there, but Durthu can carry even harder than Orion can. And I think I'll cover Durthu himself in a little bit of detail, because Durthu is a really monstrous unit. I think I'll definitely cover him, especially in the later, once we go into the late game situation. So if you're a new player and you're looking to decide which faction you want to play, Argwylon versus Wood Elves, my recommendation is definitely to do Argwylon. Of course, from a simplicity or learning to play standpoint. If you're biased towards Wood Elves, obviously don't feel bad about that. I like Wood Elves better than Argwylon personally. They're a lot of fun. It's just a different playstyle, and they are a bit more difficult to get into. The positioning for Argwylon is one of the other small downsides to it. Some small strategic disadvantages. Your first opponent, rather than being an easy-to-crush Bretonnian, is actually Karak Norn, and you don't really want to fight dwarves as the Wood Elves. Maybe in late game, but especially in early game where most of your units lack armor piercing, this can be a major pain in the rear. Your only real armor piercing options are Starfire Shafts and Eternal Guard, which neither of which is particularly great against dwarves. Starfire Shafts being doing magic damage, and of course being susceptible to Quarrelers, and Eternal Guard being susceptible to enemy ranged fire while not having the best of melee stats, at least as far as offense goes. And dwarves score for a very high melee offense, or melee defense. So all in all, that's not a great thing. And also the fact that you're positioned, Argwylon is positioned rather inconveniently from the perspective of having to defend the Oak of Ages. Well, not necessarily always. You can just use Underway to bypass trespassing problems. If the Beastmen come, and they will often come through the south because the Wood Elves won't do anything to stop them, then you will have to Underway and rush down to defend the Oak of Ages, and it's a little inconvenient. It's less convenient than the Wood Elves, who literally just move like 2 feet and are in the Oak of Ages territory. So those are just a little bit of the disadvantages. And without further ado, we can really move into the early game and kind of cover some of the differences with Argwylon. Argwylon has two options for their early to mid game. So I definitely want to cover both of those. Now, first and foremost, I want to touch on technology. Your technology priorities should be the exact same as they are for Wood Elves. You want to get Isha the Mother fairly early on, just to get that easy growth, and then Loic the Trickster to at least try to counteract your public order problems. Outside of that, Mathlin Lord of Depths is really strong. Nethu Keeper of the Last Door is really strong. Depending on if you're going for ports, which you should really with Bretonnia, definitely go for Mathlin Lord of Depths. Otherwise, the cheese strat relies on attacking Norska. So in that case, it's also good to get this upgrade. Nethu Keeper of the Last Door, very solid one. And just all in all, these upgrades are solid, but priorities should be Isha, Loic, and probably Mathlin Lord of Depths. Usually because it's just more convenient to achieve this than it is to get Nethu of the Last Keeper of the Last Door. So definitely something to keep in mind there. But Isha and Loic are the most important, in my opinion. Your early game build-up should, in my opinion, consist of the following. You do start with Haunted Groves, and all of your infantry is locked behind Amber, besides Eternal Guard. Well, actually, allow me to rephrase that. All of your melee infantry, besides Eternal Guard, is locked behind the Amber paywall, essentially. Thus, Argwylon will play very differently from Wood Elves. You're going to have a lot less DPS. You're going to be much slower to do damage. So generally, I would prioritize building up Dryads, and your early game rush is for Treekin. With Wood Elves, you can be a little more aggressive because you get War Dancers at tier 2. With Argwylon, you want to wait till you have Treekin before really making a move. So in early game, of course, you get the Haunted Groves, and your second structure should always be Grapevines just to get that money going. You do have access to Wild Riders without use of Amber, which is amazing. These will be one of your main sources of DPS, and they're a very, very strong unit. I've mentioned this before. They're even more good they're even better for Argwylon though, because Argwylon can't really rely on those Glass Cannon Wood Elf units to carry them damage-wise. Way Watchers are also locked behind Amber. Fortunately, Deepwood Scouts, even the ones with Swift Shivers, are not, so you can definitely rely on them to do a little bit of damage. But unfortunately, Fire doesn't do well with Treekin, so Gladeguard with Starfires can be a bit of a problem if you're relying on because you'll be relying on your tree units for front line, and so definitely watch out for that. Treekin should be your main front line unit, and these will ultimately, in my opinion, replace your infantry unless you're doing really some sort of I guess strange build, but really Treekin will basically end up replacing your infantry line, in my opinion. They're a very strong unit. They're a fairly cheap unit as far as upkeep is concerned, only 225 as far as Elvish upkeep is concerned. They have incredibly high melee defense. They have fairly high armor of 80, and they have built-in physical resistance. The only thing you got to watch out for is susceptibility to fire damage, and there aren't too many factions that will bring fire, but a handful are there. If you're really worried about facing them, you can recruit the Regiment of Renown, the Firebark Elders, now, but back in the day you couldn't, so that's definitely a slight improvement of life, but otherwise you don't. Main focus, these are a very tanky frontline unit, and with certain upgrades they can actually become pretty powerful in the offense as well. I will go over some of the army compositions at the sorry about that, guys. I'll go over the army compositions in the late game part of the video. That said, in your early game, the building priority should be Haunted Groves, Grapevines. Once you hit tier 2, my recommendation would be to maybe get a Roots of Giran. Usually I would go for the guard platform and then probably go for a Craftsman's Tree. You don't really need to... Normally I don't really prioritize any of the infantry buildings. I don't really prioritize the Wood Elf buildings. Another option can be a Muster Stone if you really want to get cavalry, because of course the Wild Riders are very solid and you'll want those at tier 3. At tier 3, I would definitely level up to Tribal Stones, because Treekin are your kind of crutch unit. And then kind of start fleshing out your structures. I would most likely get tech buildings, either Temple of Erithkiel or Temple of Kurnus, at least for that one-off time, just to get that technology going. And then start getting some of your ancients unlocked. You can, of course, get the Roots of Giran. And you could, if you want, invest in military building or units, but in general, because you do get Glade Guard available right off the bat, and they're not a bad archer by any means. They're probably like They're probably the second best skirmish, starting skirmish unit after the Quarrelers, and even that's a bit of a toss-up. So these guys definitely aren't bad. And so between them and the Treekin, you should have a pretty solid starting force. And plus, most of your early game will really be a grind between Durthu, Treekin, some Dryads, and Branch Wraith against most of the enemy force, maybe backed up by a few cycle charging the Wild Riders. So definitely something to keep in mind there. Your focus should really be those Treekin and Dryads, just a handful, in my opinion, no more than 4, maybe 6, but that's really pushing it, Glade Guard. So as far as early game unit composition goes, before we go, without covering late game, you can scrap, I would definitely scrap the Way Watchers, and I wouldn't really scrap the rest of this force that you start off with. So if you want, you can definitely scrap all those Strides, because you'll be buying them back at a later point, and this way you can cheapen things up and save up a little bit more money. So what you can do is you start saving up, and once you've got tier 3, you build, or as you're approaching tier 3, you build up your Glade Guard. You get those 4 Glade Guard in the slots, and then you throw in a decent amount of Treekin, probably 4 to 6 really, which leaves you with a handful of slots. You will still want 1 slot for your Branch Wraith. You will obviously have 1 slot taken up by Wild Riders, and then the rest of it should be filled up with Dryads in the early game when you want to be relatively cheap. If you can get Peace with Karak Norn, get it. You can attack Scarsnake, but generally he's a good distraction for Karak Norn, making sure they don't decide to underway and attack you. They usually won't, but you never know. Sometimes AI can do some silly things. And so what you want to do, your first priority should be Paravon. What you can attempt to do sometimes is to march south and bypass Paravon, go after Quenelles, which is down here in the south. Sorry, that's Carcassonne. There we go, Quenelles. And then after you've done that, you go after Paravon, hopefully baiting their army out into the open, perhaps ambushing them over here. Sometimes it works out. Obviously, ambush stance in early game is a little iffy because you don't quite have the technology and whatnot to make it better. But you can try to ambush Paravon, see if you can knock that army out in a field battle. Regardless, once you besiege them, you should try to get your Branch Wraith leveled up. Your first priorities should be perhaps Martial, but honestly, in my opinion, Melkot's Mystify and Miasma, and your second one should be Earthblood. So then, once you march up Paravon, you can basically win in what is a very grinding, slow, atrocious battle. Your Treekin hit like wet noodles. Your Dryads do okay and it cause fear, but your Treekin in particular, which are really your front line and kind of what you're relying on in Paravon to siege cities, they do give you Siege Attacker, but Treekin hit like wet noodles. So this will be a very long, grinding, atrocious battle. Enemy anti-large will not do particularly well against Treekin, so that is definitely a one benefit. Treekin are very, very tanky, even against anything. They're probably one of the, as far as the large unit blob units like this go, large monsters infantry units go, Treekin are probably by far the tankiest. I can't really think of any other unit that's any tankier. As far as even large units go, really only the Arachnarok, Steam Tank, and Tree Man, off the top of my head, really have comparable survivability to Treekin. So they can definitely sit tight and just kind of storm Paravon in a long, atrocious battle. And from there, you really expand outward. And this is the first strategy. There is another strategy I'll go over in a little bit. From there, you expand it much in the same way you would with the Wood Elves. Except rather than, because you're not starting from all the way in the south, my first priority would be taking out Carcassonne just to kind of solidify your backline. Then take Estalia, just like we discussed with Wood Elves, and leave a half stack there, holding it against incursion from the east from the Tillians. Do be aware that there are beastmen, and you might have to defend your Oak of Ages. Definitely leave about a quarter to half stack in Waterfell Palace. You should have fortifications here, so you should be able to hold against insurrections. Elvish insurrections are very dangerous, so you will probably have to fight the battles out. You will not simply be able to let them play out on their own, or auto-resolve them. So definitely be ready to control your armies. but you can definitely do it. Definitely defend Waterfall Palace, and hopefully defend the Oak of Ages against any beastmen. March north with Durthu after you've taken Estalia, and just kind of storm Bretonnia. As slowly but surely, just destroy Bretonnia, take everything, take the ports. With Mathlin, you should be getting massive amounts of money. Now there's an alternative to this, or not quite an alternative, but definitely sort of follow-up strategy that you can try to do. Now Durthu has a trait where he's immune to all attrition, and Norska is normally a bit of a no-go zone for most factions because they don't have attrition immunity. Elves do get attrition immunity eventually with Estriath, Lord of Hunger, but that's not early game available. So what you want to do, if you're doing this Durthu strat, is you build up Durthu's army much in the same way I described before, with Treekin, Treemen, etc. And then you really, instead of trying to fight things out over here, Paravon, going the slow and steady route, essentially playing just Wood Elves 2.0, you march straight north, and you just raise and sack whatever gets in your way to kind of keep your coffers full, and that's really it. Or you raise. I guess elves can't sack. You just raise everything in your path as you go. And if there's a fight, you just avoid it. You load up onto boats. You can also just load up on the boats here on the west coast, and then you swing north, and you just go. And you go into Norska, and you start conquering Norska. And it can be a little grindy. It is a little more difficult. I tried this out. It's a little more difficult now than it was before. It'll probably be around turn 50, 60. It's gonna be. There's a very slow early game to Argwylon, just like there is for every other faction, really, or for every other the Wood Elves. Sorry. But slowly but surely you conquer Norska, and you build up your ports here. You take the ports, you kind of defend them, and with Mathlin of the Depths, there are multiple ports up in Norska. You can make massive amounts of money, and because Norska, once you've conquered all of it, is a pretty safe place, Chaos doesn't really wander through there. This basically becomes an easy to control, and of course your own settlements, actually, your outposts have very good control bonuses, so they won't usually suffer revolts. So what you can do is you can essentially hold all of Norska and have them as your own little piggy bank, cranking out immense amounts of money. And you don't have to worry about that. And then you can march back with Durthu. You can even abandon Norska, really. Maybe leave a half stack there. You can global recruit a stack up there. It doesn't really matter. You can march Durthu south. And start conquering Bretonnia. Do that sort of stuff. All while having Norska as your personal piggy bank. This is a bit of a risky strat. You definitely want to be, especially now that Norska is a legitimate faction with a very strong roster. Cheesing it, it used to be possible to even cheese it in the very early game with just masses of dryads, essentially. This is, I think, less viable now than it used to be. It's still possible, but definitely that's a cheese strat you can do, and it's not even, it's a legitimate strat that exploits one of Durthu's biggest strengths, which is that huge defense against attrition. He just doesn't take attrition damage. So that is definitely something you can try. This is something I would generally recommend for more experienced players because the slow and steady route is perfectly serviceable, and while it might take a little longer to win the campaign that way, it might be a little more drawn out. It's safer. It's practically impossible to fail this, so in my opinion, so it's definitely, I think, an easier method to do things, especially the way Argwylon is forgiving. Now, some of the things Argwylon is much more forgiving than the Wood Elves, and a lot of this simply comes down to the Treekin plus Lore of Life, and really by late game, most of your combat will revolve around utilizing your Branch Wraith, blobbed up with a few here with Durthu and maybe a few Treemen, or in the case of other armies, your Treeman Ancient and some Treemen, or maybe some units like that, blobbed up around a hero and kind of providing all these buffs to the surrounding units. You will definitely want to be getting Call of the Woods. I would recommend. Your archers are very much a support unit in this case. In the case of Durthu, unlike the Wood Elves, where I think it's more of a toss-up, it's very much up to the player. I think in the case of Durthu, because you can't get the top tier archers, it's generally, and you're very reliant on your Treeman / Treekin / dragons and Hawk Riders. It's generally better to invest in close quarters skills. In general, I will be going over Durthu's build in a second once we go into late. Actually, we'll hop into late game and discuss some of the Argwylon late game. But definitely, and I can demonstrate what some of the skill builds there are. So yeah, without further ado, let's hop over to late game situation. So here we are in a bit of a late game situation as Argwylon. As you can see, I actually haven't conquered all of Bretonnia in this situation, and the reason for that is that Empire and Marienburg and a lot of these eastern countries, or these eastern And the factions got or countries, I guess. I don't know. They decided to declare war on me, and so I ended up, instead of going all the way through with the Bretonia, I ended up just giving them a peace treaty and marching east, just kind of rolling everything over here, taking Altdorf, taking Weissman, and all that stuff. So looking over my comps, most of these were global recruited. You can see it's a bit of a mixed bag, but as you can see, the main front line here is Treekin. This is actually the armies that defeated Argwylon and most of the Chaos armies. There's still a handful wandering around because I haven't quite... obviously, Argwylon has been resummoned because of the way Chaos works. But as you can see, these guys, they're just kind of very solid against Chaos. So some of the things that you definitely want to invest in are your generic tree men, I think. Skewering Branch and Skin of the Woods. Now, Skewering Branch is simply a +10 armor piercing damage for Treekin, and this is huge because Treekin have pretty trash armor piercing damage, or actually damage in general. So this will make him much more solid as far as raw damage output goes. And Skin of the Woods is a big ward save bonus for Treekin, so this will make an already tanky unit even more tanky. And you can see that this guy's it applies to all your, as far as I know, it applies to all your units. I could be wrong. I think it should apply to. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to figure out what the exact bonus is because this time around, is rather than building a whole bunch of the economic structures, I decided to build a whole bunch of sacrificial grounds. So I boosted my damage a lot more. But as you can see, most of my armies do revolve around a horde of Treekin, essentially replacing my infantry line, backed by some treemen, some dragons, and then wild riders and archers just backing that up. And your late game comps should really be this, I think, or something similar to this. A good solid amount of Treekin, some treemen to kind of create a goon squad of heroes, which can kind of stomp enemy lords. Some forest dragons, wild rider, because forest dragons cause terror, and they can drop behind enemies. Treemen cause terror too, but they're not as mobile. And forest dragons do have armor piercing. They do cause poison. You can just drop behind enemies and just cause damage that way. Wild riders, they cause fear and can be cycled behind enemies. And they also have the tech that affects wood elves, and there's quite a bit of it will affect them and give them better armor and that sort of stuff. So they're a very solid unit choice. They're also probably one of your best units for shutting down enemy skirmish. And Glade Guard, of course, still a decent choice even in the late game. They're one of the few tier 1 units that I think really remains very solid. Here you can see Durthu's army. I actually doubled up on branch race with him, though this was specifically for the quest battle, because I was simply looking for. I had a bunch of Dryads in his army originally. Here you can see him in Orion's army, and I didn't really want to be bringing him into this final battle, so I switched him out for some branch race because the branch race is very solid. As you can see here, Durthu's an absolute monster, sitting at 112 melee attack, 89 melee defense, 710 weapon strength, of which the majority is armor piercing, massive charge bonus, and this is all and 122 armor. And this is all before we consider Frenzy, which is one of the cool things about Durthu. So, which gives him +8 melee attack, +12% weapon damage, which means he's close to 800 damage. If you want to show my kind of skill lineup for him, I didn't really bother with armor. His units already have pretty solid armor, and they kind of rely on that physical resistance and all that stuff. So I think this is a bit of overkill. Striking Branches, you don't really rely on charge bonus, but Forest Roar is very much worthwhile because your units have pretty pitiful, and as is Swinging Bows, just for that extra weapon damage. I don't think you need to max out Howl of the Forest, because quite frankly, 30 meters is enough. 40 meters is cool and all, but it is a point that could be spent better. I did not invest at all in Durthu's magic, and because you will usually have another caster supporting Durthu, and it'll usually be a Branch Wraith or maybe a Lore of Life spellcaster or something like that, because you definitely want to have Lore of Life. It's not really important to have Durthu be that capable of a spellcaster, in my opinion, especially because he's such a good melee combatant. As you can see, I invested in his weapon strength and his melee attack and melee defense. That's really what's making him an absolute monster. Plus Deadly Onslaught to get just a little bit more damage because it's not enough. And he can really murder most heroes in a handful of hits, 2 to 3 really, maybe 4 on some of the bigger ones. So you can definitely kill heroes incredibly quickly, especially when paired with the treemen backing up. Home Amongst the Boughs, very solid one. Perenniality, all the usual elven buffs, getting extra post-battle loot. Rage of Kurnus, Sword of Death. Durthu does not have the option to buff his treemen with extra armor piercing, but other than that, he's very solid. He himself is an absolute monster and can single-handedly carry games, especially in early game. The Branch Wraiths are basically there just to provide Earth Blood. And the Branch Wraiths themselves, I would spec into a much more melee-oriented build. Just do the bare minimum, in my opinion. Evasion is pretty pointless, in my opinion, as on a unit like Branch Wraith. I usually just invest in Earth Blood, Smoke and Mirrors to get that extra little bit of mobility across the army. Sometimes Shield of Isha, but that's not always necessary. Main thing should be your bottom line. Get Call of the Woods to boost surrounding units so that I can kind of be a demi-commander, and then Exemplar, get Wonders of the Forest maxed out eventually, and invest a little bit in combat stats. Tempered Rigor especially is very strong for Wood Elves because of the massive boost to melee attack and melee defense it provides. But Violent Delights, Impenetrable Bark, and Endurance of the Oak are all very solid individual upgrades if you have the points to spare. With generic Treemen, you will generally, that's Orion, so that's not really important, but for generic Treemen, this guy is pretty new, but obviously similar bottom line to Durthu, similar line here to Durthu. You will want to get Skewering Branch. You will though want to invest in Earthblood at least. And their melee stats are not as good as Durthu, so it's not necessarily as important to make them such a good general. Though Tempered Rigor is usually a very strong choice no matter what you do, just because it's a very solid overall buff. Dwellers Below has been highly buffed, so combined with Arcane Conduit and all that, it's probably best to max out your spells, and so is Life Bloom. So it's just a very solid spell line for the Treeman. As far as fighting Chaos goes, utilize Waystalkers, of course, to assassinate enemy heroes. Try to take battles with Chaos around your kind of little strong points here, around your various Waystones and that sort of stuff, just so you have a slightly stronger forces. Do keep in mind that, for example, if you take Altdorf actually has a stronger than average garrison. You get a Forest Dragon there, you get a Treeman, as well on top, and Hawkeye, and a bunch of other free. I guess you get a bunch of free stuff there that you don't normally get. So there's just a very solid garrison there in Altdorf, and it's the same situation for Corone, who I don't really control. So if you can get your fights to happen around there, or even a generic Waystone, definitely try to bait it. Shriekin can be very tanky against Chaos. They're very high melee defense, and Chaos is fairly mediocre melee attack on most of its units, so you can definitely kind of outlast them with the help of Earthblood and Forest Dragons to shock the Chaos troops into routing. Other than that, for your final battle, the Beastmen don't bring too much in the way of skirmish units. I would definitely bring a few Wild Riders, and in retrospect, maybe a handful of mounted either Glade Riders, or so that you don't really have to babysit them, so they can just escape on their own, or maybe some Swift Shiver Shards to shut down enemy skirmish cav, because you can't really do anything against that with Durthu and company. The Treekin are obviously pretty slow and have no ranged. Hawk Riders will also do an okay job. That's why I brought them. They were kind of my skirmish contingent. And they are a very strong support unit for diving enemy backline and bringing some armor piercing to the field when dealing with Bestigors or monsters like that. Though Beastmen don't have much in the way of armor. And yeah, that's basically it for late game. Otherwise, Durthu plays very similar to otherwise, he's pretty similar to Wood Elves. As far as build structures and all that go, you shouldn't really avoid using up too much amber on your units. Just use the amber that you have, at least initially, on technology, and leveling up your structures and leveling up your tree, and then deal with units later. You don't really need the Elven-based units. It's much easier to play without them as Durthu, because his unit roster is much more forgiving, in my opinion. So I think that's really it. If you enjoyed this guide, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any comments, criticism, anything you think I missed in this guide, be sure to mention that down in the comments so other people can see, and so I can respond as soon as I can. Next guide should be Greenskins. I will be continuing my gameplay of Sanctus Reach and Wolfric's campaign, as well as the daily quick match uploads. As usual, I do hope you enjoyed, and I appreciate you all for watching. And I'll see you in the next one, guys. Wyvern out.